Marvel Snap's newest game mode, High Voltage, is here. Let's talk about everything you need to know about the game mode and the best decks for you to win as many High Voltage games as possible. For those unaware of the rules of High Voltage, it only lasts 3 turns. Each player starts with 2 cards in hand and then gains either 2, 3, 4, or 5 maximum energy at the start of the turn. There are no snaps, and each player draws 2 cards per turn. The currency in High Voltage is called Volts. You can get it from either completing missions or winning games. High Voltage missions refresh every 8 hours, and there will always be a 125 volt mission, a 250 volt mission, and a 500 volt mission. This means every 8 hours you will have a chance at acquiring a large number of volts. You should be able to acquire the entire track without having to do much at all, as long as you simply complete your missions each day. You can also refresh your missions in order to get extra missions. So if you end up falling behind, if you miss a couple of resets, you should be all right. I did a little rudimentary math, and with the missions, there should be, just by doing all the missions that pop up every 8 hours, you should get about 20,000 volts, which is well beyond what you need to complete the reward track here. The main reward people will be looking for from High Voltage will be the new card Agony. Agony is a Series 4 card that acts as something of a reverse Hulkbuster. You play her out, and she merges into the next card you play on that location. Right now, there hasn't been a lot of exploration with Agony, as the only real way to get her would be to spend money on gold in order to acquire as many missions as possible. This is totally doable. If you feel like doing it, feel free. However, I learned from last time there was an event like this that when you get the card too early and then make a video too early, you're making a video for people that don't have the card yet, and it ends up being sort of disregarded. So I am going to wait until a little bit later in the week to actually pick up Agony. That also means, and I think this is the number one piece of advice I can give you, is that you don't need to stress about this mode. There's no punishment for losing, there's a reward for winning, and you can complete all your quests in this mode. You can do everything you want with absolutely no punishment, which is, in my opinion, the best part about this mode, period. What High Voltage demonstrates to me is that there is a massive desire for a casual mode where people don't have to worry about winning. And because I'm me, I'm here to ruin that with a bunch of really good decks so you can beat people up. Let's start here. There are several cards in here that are uniquely good in High Voltage. As you may know, I am pretty much a good cards aficionado. What I do is I play good cards and I make other people feel bad for trying to do fun and cool things. If you are interested in doing that in High Voltage, there are a couple new format all-stars you're going to have to get to know. The first is Ebony Maw, who is just straight up a 1/7 in a mode where games end on turn 3. That is a 1/7. The next is Havoc, who is just usually a 2/8 in a mode where you have 12 energy on the final turn of the game. It's not actually that big of a cost to be playing Havoc. Next up is Baron Zemo, who is taking cards that your opponent put in the deck, which are almost always good, and putting them on the board at a 3/5 rate, because so many of these decks are decks that are like this. When you look at this, there's basically no bad hits. The same goes for Morph. The way this game mode tends to play out, the first turn has between 2 and 5 energy attached to it, which means they're playing a couple of things that are relatively small. A Morph on that turn can hit one of their bigger cards because there are only going to be, 3 cards in hand, and everyone is playing a bunch of really big stuff in this game mode. This game mode has quickly evolved to be all about greed, and you'll see that through line in the decks that we talk about today. There are synergy decks, but a lot of people are just playing various forms of what I would describe as good cards pile. And there's going to be different versions of that, right? Like you could take this deck and play Leader. You don't have to be a Skaar deck, right? Skaar is another card that I think gets a lot of value out of this because you're able to put a bunch of big guys on the board. But there's multiple strategies to get to that same end state. Finally, Alioth is a card people are going to get a lot of hate on you for. And I think that's reasonable, right? This is a mode that is kind of a non-try-hard mode, and you're in here just playing a pile of ridiculously good cards and optimizing for it. I do think that there is something to be said for, hey, just play whatever you want. It actually doesn't matter as long as you complete your missions, you'll still get the card. That said, I know people don't like playing decks just to lose. In terms of point output, Zoo is actually a genuinely good choice, although the downsides that this deck has are sometimes you just draw the wrong half of the deck, you just don't really get the stuff that actually puts the points on the board. But a lot of the time, this deck is going to be able to have a very reasonable and very powerful point output that is actually like the kind of thing that can be confusing and surprising on the final turn of the game, where level 1 of deck building in high voltage is just play all the good cards. Level 2 is something more similar to this. You'll note that also you could just play an Ebony Maw in here instead of any of the 1-drops here. What you can do with any of these decks is take some good cards from the good cards shell and put them into this. And I think that over the course of the week, we'll start seeing stuff like that happen. We'll see more Ebony Maws in Zoo. We'll see more Havocs in Zoo. We'll see more of the good generic stat sticks make their way into these synergy decks that they can fit in. Right now, that hasn't happened, and Untap.gg has rated Zoo as one of the more better performing decks in this mode, and I do have to trust that. I am going to willingly trust data. We'll talk a little bit about matchmaking in this mode, but in brief, matchmaking is roughly correlated with your ladder rank. I'm playing a lot of the people that I would normally play on ladder, but it's not like a hard lock or anything. It feels like a larger bound of people that I'm allowed to play than I would be playing on ladder. So I am kind of happy with that. It does mean that it makes it tough to parse data though, because the better players are mostly playing against better players and the worst players are mostly playing against worse players. There is some worry for me when I look at Untapped and I see Zoo doing well and I say, you know, I have a couple friends who are vouching for Zoo. I've played Zoo and it's fine. There is a worry for me that like maybe this is the kind of thing that isn't doing as well as it appears because of the way MMR bracketing works in this format and because there is no way to sort Untapped by said MMR bracketing. But what I'm getting at here is you don't have to just be a stats deck. You don't have to just be, here are all my good cards, here is the method I'm going to use to get the good card stats down. You can also be a normal synergy-based deck and compete. The good cards decks are not that far ahead of everything else in this format. One comment I see a lot is how hard it is to make decks when you don't have Series 4 and 5 cards. This Patriot list is actually quite powerful in the mode and is able to output massive amounts of power with minimal interaction from your opponent. One of the things you might have noticed from that good cards deck is that the main interaction that seems to be being played in this mode right now is Shang-Chi. And so if you play a deck like Zoo, if you play a deck like Patriot, where you are going very, very wide and pretty tall, but not tall enough to get Shang-Chi'd, that seems to be a bit of the sweet spot right now. The only thing that's going to get you Shang-Chi'd here is Abomination, and like sometimes you're going to have an Onslaught on a Blue Marvel and an Ultron, and that Ultron can get Shang-Chi'd, but that's like not a really likely occurrence, right? And so this deck sort of hits a sweet spot of being hard to interact with the most played interaction, and outputting a lot of points in a way that is very, very generally powerful. This is a good deck in this format. Again, synergy decks do work. And this one is a little bit more specific in the synergy it requires, so I would expect to see even less of the fused in good cards aspect that has happened in other various formats. I think this deck can actually do very well, especially if you are a budget player. Now, again, something I really want to drill down on in this video is that since there are no punishments for losing, you can actually just go do whatever you want as long as it completes your quest. And I think that is something that is so foreign to many of my viewers and to me even, where it's like, you know, all I do is optimize decks. I try to find the best decks, the best things, but like the optimal thing for this mode is whatever gets your quests done. Doesn't have to be great. Guess who's back? Back again. Hela's back. Tell a friend. I think Hela is a genuinely functional strategy in this game mode, in part because it just plays a bunch of big guys anyway, right? So let's say you're not actually Helaing. All right, I mean, that sucks, but you still have a ton of energy with which to just drop giant 6-drops on the board, and that's usually just good enough. You don't need to be always Helaing. Obviously, you know, you're drawing 8 cards. You're probably Helaing a lot. But like one of the other advantages that this deck has, this archetype has, is cards like Blink and Jubilee are actually quite powerful in this archetype because you can just like turn 1 Jubilee, turn 2 Blink. Suddenly you have very large dudes on the board. Even if you're not Helaing, you're really dumping a lot of power when you do stuff like that. And having these multiple paths to putting a ton of power on the board is a very, very strong thing to do in a game mode where right now it's very much 2 ships passing in the night. People are playing some interaction, but it really is mostly just, is my stuff bigger than yours? And a lot of the time, the stuff that you play in this deck is going to be bigger than what they play. I'm also going to use this time to talk a little bit about Arishem, because one of the main complaints I've seen about this game mode is, oh my god, they brought Hela back and they brought Arishem back. Let's start with Hela. I think Hela is a real deck. I think there are some real power levels that can be applied to this deck where, like, this is not an embarrassing choice. I think it's actually a pretty good one. Arishem is an embarrassing choice. When both of you have a bunch of extra energy, getting +1 energy diminishes in value. It does not make up for the fact that you have a bunch of garbage in your deck. It simply does not. Having 2 energy on turn 1 is having twice as much energy as they do. Having an additional, +1 when both of you have 5 is not the same. And that is the fundamental downfall of Arishem in this format. I'm not saying you can't play it. You can, but I would not recommend it. I think basically every other deck that has a cohesive game plan that fits with this game mode will do better than Arishem. Hela, on the other hand, is real and is good because it has this other game plan of Jubilee, Blink, and just playing big guys that can get you 2 wins. I want to say this is a deck that Bynx made. All I know is that he played it against me or something similar to it. And the real card I want to highlight here is Professor X, who is not a card that has seen a lot of play in the real world, but in high voltage, it is a genuine monster. People are not playing a lot of cards that move in this format because everyone is devoting to synergies or to giant dudes or to, both, right? And so Professor X ends up being this absolute beast mode card. You can like turn 1 Professor X some of the time, but turn 2 Professor X with like a Hydra Bob and an Ebony Maw is usually just gonna do it, right? And so you end up having a very powerful card that just says win a lane on its own almost all of the time. Not a lot of people are playing things that can deal with Prof X. Do keep in mind when you're playing Prof X that there are potential for things like Claw. The other card I want to highlight here is Wiccan, who is just a card that sometimes you'll be able to play on turn 1, get 2 extra energy out of, and he's a 4/7. There's basically not a lot of downside to including a Wiccan in your deck. He's just a good card that will sometimes mean that you have even more energy than your opponent. I played against Bynx with this deck. He had 14 energy on turn 6. I had 12. It wasn't nearly as impactful as it would have been in a normal game, but I did lose because Professor X exists. And I think that that is the thing that I really wanted to highlight here. It's those 2 cards. The other stuff in here is very much like good card shell type stuff. We see the Morph, we see the Ebony Maw. One thing I am interested in is trying things like Havoc in a deck like this. It does seem like the kind of deck that cries out for a Havoc, and let's slip the Dogs of War with Havoc inside of Professor X here. But I do think that the shape is really what I'm trying to get at here. Remember, this is day 1 of a new game mode. It hasn't even been 24 hours yet. So when we talk about best decks, what we're really talking about is shapes for you to investigate. So what's the shape you're investigating here? Well, Black Panther Arnim Zola is the shape you're investigating here. It's a very powerful thing to do. Other things you're investigating include Leader and Odin the Leader. That is the kind of thing that this deck is really looking at, right? Like, this is a deck that is saying, all right, everyone else is doing good card stuff. They're doing synergy stuff. What if we made 64 power Black Panthers? And then what if we Odin'd that Zola lane? Like, what if we just went absolutely bonkers with this? What if we went Black Panther Arnim Zola, Odin the Arnim Zola lane? What if that's what we're doing here? And I think that is just a really strong thing to do, because everyone else is sort of counting in tens, right? When you're playing your good cards deck, you're playing a lot of like Skaards and Red Hulks and stuff like that. They're counting in tens. If you can start scaling multiplicatively rather than additively, that is a way to have a good matchup against those decks. In a game of high voltage, you see 8 cards per game. This means that it is actually semi-functional to attack your opponent's hand in a meaningful way. Goon Knight is attempting to do that, discarding cards out of your opponent's hand such that you have more resources than them. As always, this is kind of an iffy strategy because if you don't hit the right stuff or they happen to draw correctly, you're going to get got when it comes to power. I cannot stress enough that the actual power level of this deck is shockingly low. But if you open on turns of like filling up your opponent's board with a hood and then also discarding a card, and then your next turn is like, okay, it's time to play, Spider Ham and Black Bolt. And suddenly, like, they see 8 cards a game. 3 of them are gone, and they are playing a lot of cards during this game. And that's how you try to win. Issues. You can't play tech, and it's kind of hard to get points into here. You can get points into here, but it's not the easiest thing in the world. You can also use your rocks to blank draws, and that again is like a really important, different way to approach this game mode, where everyone else is approaching it in terms of output. This deck approaches it in terms of limiting that output. Another card that's really good in this game mode is Cassandra Nova, because you're very often playing her very early, so she's hitting a much larger segment of the deck than she normally would. She ends up being a very large lady, especially if you're able to get Rock Slides and Korgs into the deck. The issue I think I find with this deck is like, there's just some bits of it that don't make a ton of sense to me right now. I'm not sure why we're doing Hood Viper in a format like this. I feel like more direct hand disruption is kind of what we need, but there kind of isn't that. And so it feels like this is, again, we're talking about shapes and directions. This is a direction that actually I do think could be fruitful. We have this ability to disrupt our opponent, to say, you get 8 cards per game. I'm going to get rid of 3 of them. Can you beat me with 5 cards? But I think maybe we should be able to fuse that with something else, be able to bring another package in that just has more power. Like, what if we're just playing Havoc and, Ebony Maw instead of those cards? I feel like it probably has to be better, but this is what people are playing right now. And I do think we can evolve on top of that, but I'm not going to do my normal KM best thing of let's just take 2 good cards and put them in, an otherwise good deck and then be like, I innovated the archetype. I'm going to talk about the archetype, and then if you want to make those innovations, you could be my guest. I think that the most important thing for you to know about this game mode is that there's no downside to playing it. You're not going to lose ranks. You're not going to lose anything. It is a perfect place for you to finish not just your high voltage quests, obviously, but also your daily quests. For all of you who've been asking for a casual mode, this is your casual mode. It is your big win. In terms of competitive integrity, I really don't think there is any, and I think that's fine. This is a mode for you to finish your quests in, for you to go and have fun, and most of the skill expression that I've found is in the deck building. Because there's no snaps and there's no retreats, you are not actually able to leverage your skill. You just sort of let things happen. It's fireworks, right? This is as close as we've ever gotten to a snap auto battler. We're not actually engaging with our opponent beyond where we put the cards, and that's a fine thing. I enjoy that fine. A lot of my higher level friends have come to me and said, KM, I really hate this mode. And that makes sense, because they have less agency and less room to express their skill, and it's so much more about, did I guess the right lane to Eliath, their leader? Oh, I didn't, guess I lose. But here's the thing. Losing shouldn't make you feel bad because it progresses your quests all the same. Your quests are the most important thing in this mode. If you clear all of your quests every 8 hours, you will end up with so many more points than you actually need to unlock not just Agony, but also that Iron Man variant. This is a low stress, happy place for everyone who's been asking for that, and I do think that that is an awesome addition to the game so far. It's not the kind of thing that's going to hold my attention for an extended period of time. It's very much just log on, do my quest simulator. But there are people for whom this is a much more fun experience, and the safety of it, I think, is a big part of that. Let me know what you think about high voltage in the comments. As always, I have been KM Best. You have been phenomenal, and I will see you in the next one.